Good morning, everyone. We're just about ready to begin. A few reminders before the webinar begins to just make sure that you are muted. You should be able to find the mute button in the Zoom interface. Obviously, we're looking forward to your questions. We've already received some questions through other platforms, but feel free throughout the webinar to either raise your hand so that you can ask a question live at the end of the webinar, or you can type it into the chat box on the right. The chat box also contains some important information related to the presentation. First of all, there's a link there, if you scroll to the top of the chat box, that will take you to the most recent report that we have released related to this webinar. That was published just last month. Also, you have a link after that to a page on the website that describes in more detail about options to customize the model that we will be talking about today. It contains more detail on the type of variables that we are able to customize for partners going forward. And lastly, some email information. Email for myself and also for Dr. Andrea Bassi. And so that is there in case you would like to contact either of us after the webinar is complete. Just a reminder, a few people have asked about links. Just make sure you scroll up to the top of the chat box to access the links. As the webinar goes on and there's more chats, you'll have to make sure that you do that. So good, we are ready to begin now. I'm going to quickly share my screen. So today we are here talking about results from modeling that we've been doing for around 5 years now related to emission reductions associated with the Paris Climate Conference in 2015. This is a joint initiative between myself. My firm is called Dual Citizen. It's based in the United States, and we focus on data analytics and sustainability. We also published the biennial Global Green Economy Index, which will be having its 10th anniversary edition later this year. And it's a collaboration with Dr. Andrea Bassi, who will be also presenting today. Andrea is the CEO of KnowlEdge SRL, which is a Geneva-based consultancy working with international clients, exploring the socioeconomic and environmental complexities that inform decision-making for sustainability. So as I've mentioned, we started this collaborative project in 2015 around the Paris Climate Agreement. And what we did and what we were interested in looking at fundamentally was establishing a model for tracking two main scenarios or two main pathways that these different countries making emission reduction pledges in Paris were committing to. One was a business as usual pathway, which would be the trajectory of these different markets if no significant policy or market interventions were introduced. And another was what we call a low carbon pathway, which would be defined as what type of emission reductions can be achieved if different countries were as ambitious as possible around different policy or market interventions. So when we started in 2015, we obviously were just at the beginning of this journey, and we were mostly looking at assumptions about what may unfold in the subsequent years. The advantage we have now, 5 years later, is that we actually have data. So we can look at what type of low carbon scenario was simulated in 2015, and then we can compare that to the actual outcome. And that's something that Andrea will explain more when he gets into the nuts and bolts of the model. But it's unique because in comparing this low carbon scenario that we simulated compared to actual performance, we can begin to really dig into the nuance of the why. So why were there divergences? Why were there countries that are overperforming or underperforming? And what is the system of the economy and the market context that explains those divergences? So as I said, we've already released two main reports linked to this work. The first one was in 2015, which you can access also on the website. And the second one was just released last month, where a lot of this updated information for the markets was presented. The 11 markets that are currently included in our modeling and research are listed here. They are Brazil, Canada, China, Germany, India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It's still limited. Obviously, we would love to expand this to cover more countries around the world. We selected these 11 markets because they contribute today around 60% of global emissions. So we thought that it was a good start in terms of setting up a baseline for the modeling. But obviously, our goal is to expand the coverage as we can in the coming months and years. And just to reiterate, the URL, which is also listed in the chat box to access the most recent 2020 report is here. So I'm going to just set the context a little bit before I pass the microphone to Andrea to just understand why we think this work is so relevant today in 2020. Obviously, globally, we're going through a massive disruption at the moment with the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had a very significant impact on GDP across the world and also on, we think, what will be around a 7 or 8% reduction in global emissions this year. So that much is clear. And I think that what is the deeper question, and a question that we've been grappling with in many webinars that I've been going to in the past few months, are how do we understand this disruption? Is this disruption a temporary decline that is analogous to when GDP goes down in a country in a given year, and you might see a corresponding reduction in emissions? Or does this disruption in 2020 represent fundamental change? Does it represent a different way that we will return to business as usual in terms of consumption, energy use, the system of behavior globally that contributes to all these macro data points around emissions and other factors? The word systems is very important to our work as well. And it's another big question that we are asking through this research and really pushing into the forefront around what is the trajectory around systems thinking and what maybe can COVID do to accelerate the awareness and adoption of systems thinking among both decision makers and the general population. So to give an example, it's very clear around the world related to COVID-19 that the system strain on biodiversity and the limits on biodiversity are directly linked to the rise and spread of the global pandemic, in addition to many other factors. So given the amount of impact and publicity this linkage between biodiversity and economic loss has had in 2020, what type of changes might happen in subsequent years around the acknowledgement of linkages between systems and climate change and other global challenges. And lastly, we all know that the climate transition must accelerate in the 2020s for countries to achieve NDCs that they are establishing and increasing ambition on next year in COP26. But what we know less about is how in different markets this acceleration is best looked at and analyzed and situated around policy and market interventions. So that's another big question that Andrea and I have been thinking a lot about. And with that, I am going to pass the virtual microphone to Andrea, who will walk us through some of the key takeaways and findings from the research.
Well, thank you, Jeremy, also for the nice introduction, and hello, everyone. While I describe the model, which is probably the most boring part, Jeremy, if you could post the links again, because I see that most people could not see them. Maybe they joined a bit late and they cannot see them at the top. That would be great. So there is something entertaining besides me talking about the model in the meantime. So I'll start by describing what we have done in 2015, because we use the same model now for this update. First of all, we developed a framework that allows us to understand the impact of policy, in this case, energy efficiency on the demand side and renewable energy on the supply side, to understand what are the outcomes for the implementation of such investments on a variety of dimensions. Normally, we refer to social, economic, and environmental dimensions, the three main pillars of sustainable development. And here we consider emissions on the environmental side. We look at the energy bill and the impact that this will have on GDP on the economic side. And then we look at employment on the social side. So in a way, we created this simplified framework, if you will, that extends a bit on the most conventional energy models, starts linking to what are normally the macroeconomic assessments being done with an explicit consideration for employment. And in that study, we noticed that there are synergies, but there are also trade-offs. Trade-offs mostly on the cost side. There are some expensive interventions and investments that can give us emission reductions and creation of employment. But at the same time, there are also other specific interventions, say on the energy efficiency side, the so-called low-hanging fruits, that can give us a boost on the economic side, a reduction of emissions, and the creation of employment at the same time. So what we have done now, when we come now to 2020, is what I do quite often, just out of curiosity for the simulation models I develop. I go back to what I've done 5, 10, or more years ago, and I want to check if the forecasts I created back then are actually consistent with the new data that have emerged over the last 5, 10, 15 years. Now, this is basically comparing the projections I created with the new data that become available. And there is always a lot to learn. In a way, I can see whether I missed on some emerging trend, or I can determine whether I was able to reproduce fairly well some of the key dynamics on population, economic growth, maybe energy consumption and energy use as a result of population and economic growth, or maybe technology development. And you see, these are the same drivers we have here towards the center of this diagram. Energy demand is driven by GDP, population, technology, energy prices, and subsidies as two connected factors. And supply is driven by investments, but also affected by demand, of course. So what we wanted to do in this case is to compare what was our forecast in 2015. Jeremy said that for the baseline and the low carbon scenario that was aligned with the ambition in the INDCs, and what has happened in the past 3 years, just to compare what governments have done and whether they have managed to achieve the level of ambition they had in the past. And let's see what we can learn from this process, from this sort of unpacking of the data. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the key findings, and we'll take it step by step here. We'll go through the process step by step. So first of all, if you look backwards in the period 2015-2018, we see that there are some countries that have actually achieved a faster, stronger emission reduction than we expected, or they stated in their INDCs. Others instead that are a bit behind. But the causes are very different. Let's take the case of Brazil, for instance. The emission reduction is 4.07%. That is what has been achieved. Let's see what happened to GDP and population. GDP has grown by 3.77%. Population has grown by 2.44%. Now, it seems like a very good achievement. We had growth of GDP. We had growth of population. Nevertheless, we have seen a reduction in emissions. So this is an assessment we can do for each of the countries we have analyzed. We can see a similar type of trend for the US as well. Emissions, in this case, minus 0.3%, so more conservative But at the same time, GDP grew by 7%, almost 7.1%, and population also by close to 2%. So here we can start connecting the main drivers of change, GDP and population, as they drive energy use to emissions. Now let's go to the next slide so that we can use the example of Brazil to break down a little bit this analysis, because there is a lot in between population and GDP and emissions. I mean, there is the whole energy sector there. So if you look at Brazil in detail, we see that in our case, when we created the projections back in 2015, we expected an increase in emissions, a 2.05% between 2015 and 2018 in the business as usual scenario, and plus 0.45% in the low carbon scenario. But emissions, in fact, have declined by 4.1%. So why is that the case? We have two main explanations here, and both point in the same direction, point to the potential for reducing emissions up to 4.1%, as we have seen. First, the GDP of Brazil increased by a slower rate than expected. So it grew, in fact, by 2.3% less on average during the period than what was expected and forecasted in 2015. So the expected GDP growth rate was 1.13% per year. The actual GDP growth rate during the same period was minus 1.17. So we actually had a reduction instead of seeing growth in the GDP. And so this highlights one key driver already explaining why emissions declined, because the economy did not increase. The economy actually shrunk in this specific period of time, which led to a reduction of energy demand and therefore emissions. In addition to that, we see that solar and wind power generation, the capacity, so the investment that went into these technologies, increased considerably. We go from 23 megawatts in 2015, recorded for solar PV, to 2,300 in 2018. It's a massive increase. Wind went from 7,600 megawatts to 14,400 megawatts in the period 2015-2018, so it doubled. And so this increase in renewable energy supply has reduced the amount of emissions that have been created in the power generation sector. Now, adding that on top of the fact that GDP did not grow as much as expected, both factors give us reduced energy consumption, reduced carbon intensity of the energy sector, and as a result, the reduction in emissions. So here, as you see, we are unpacking a bit the trends that we see in emissions to understand what has changed in relation to expectations. And these expectations are not only our expectations. These are expectations from the IMF, the World Economic Outlook of 2015. These are the projections that governments took into account when agreeing to the Paris Climate Agreement, basically, when determining their level of ambition, desired level of ambition. And so we can see how the macroeconomic situation changes and how it can support or actually create more challenges for the achievement of the emission reduction targets. Now, on to the next slide. What we can see here is an assessment of whether the effort in reducing emissions has increased after the Paris Agreement was signed. So as I said before, we have started looking at the trend of emissions. We started analyzing what is going on, what has happened, what has been going on over time for these countries. But that analysis doesn't really tell us the pace at which the countries are improving in terms of action. It only tells us there are some underlying changes that affect emissions. But what about the speed of action? What about the amount of investment that goes into reducing emissions? Now, we created this index to simply compare the level of carbon intensity in the country and its annual rate of change between 2015 and 2018 as compared to the decade before, as compared to 2005, 2015. So in other words, on an annual basis, have countries decarbonized faster since 2015 than what they've done since 2005? Or have they decarbonized more slowly, meaning that they have reduced the effort to decarbonize after the Paris Agreement was signed? So here are some interesting outcomes. We see from the graph at the top that Japan and Mexico performed very well. It seems like they've put in a lot more effort since 2015. Most other countries are just about the same level. Brazil is performing okay, we know that the emissions have declined. South Korea is also performing quite well, Germany as well. Others are just about at par, same level of effort and performance. And then we have Indonesia and the United States, which have performed worse or not as good in decarbonizing the economy as they've done in the previous 10 years. Now, we need to contextualize a bit these results in a couple of different ways. First of all, the fact that Indonesia and the US have not performed as well, or that they have reduced the effort that they put into decarbonizing, doesn't mean that they are the worst performers overall. It may mean that they were the early movers, implemented a lot of actions and investments early on, and then either because they have exhausted the easy projects, the low-hanging fruits, or because of political changes and different priorities at the government level, this progress has slowed down in the last couple of years. So we need to say here that we don't have winners and losers. This is really a graph that helps us interpret the speed of change. And then we can think about why that speed of change has increased or declined over time. Now, second point that I think is very interesting here, as we said, or as I mentioned just now, Mexico is one of the best performers. If you see the graph here, it looks like it's the second country in terms of you're putting a lot more effort now as opposed to what they did in 2005, 2015. But if we look at the graph at the bottom is where we see the change in carbon intensity, or the carbon intensity of GDP. We will see that Mexico moves from a 0.36% improvement on average every year in reducing carbon intensity until 2015 to an average annual improvement of 0.86% between 2015 and 2018. So overall, the rate of improvement is very, very small. On the other hand, the improvement after 2015, 0.86, is much larger than what they've achieved before, 0.36. So again, the graph at the top tells us whether the level of effort has increased, but it doesn't tell us anything about whether it's enough, to achieve the ambition. And we can see that, for instance, with the UK. It's just about there, same level of effort before 2015 and after 2015. But if you look at the graph at the bottom, they have managed to reduce carbon intensity of the economy by more than 4% every year, consistently since 2005. Same with China. It's a bit better now than it was before, but in the past 10 years, 2005, 2015, they achieved a 3.9% reduction every year in carbon intensity. And since 2015, we're at 4.72%. So I think this provides some more insights, some more elements for discussion to understand where do we need to go from here. So we have seen what has happened in the past. We have seen whether the pace of decarbonization has accelerated or not. But the next step is we need to put this into context and see how far we are based on what has happened up to now in achieving the targets we have for the longer term. So let's go to the next slide. And here we can see what is required in terms of carbon intensity reduction for the economy to achieve the 2030 targets mentioned in the NDCs. Now, whole different story here again. You can see that, first of all, no one can or has the luxury to increase carbon intensity. All countries have to reduce it. But Indonesia and India, since they have less ambitious emission reduction targets than most other countries in our 11-country group, they have to reduce carbon intensity less, by 1% Indonesia and 11% India. Now, don't take this as an indication that this would be easy to do, because as you can imagine, the expected growth rate of GDP and population for India and Indonesia is larger than what we may see for other countries. And so again, this provides context on where countries need to go, but it doesn't give us a specific answer as to whether this would be easy or not in general. Then let's look at some of the other countries. If you look at Canada, China, they have made progress so far. China is one of the countries that we mentioned before. It has managed to reduce emissions by about 4% per year between 2005 and 2018 overall. Canada, about 2% per year. But the level of ambition is a lot higher than what has been achieved up to now. They have to reduce carbon intensity by 50% or more by 2030. So while we are able now to explain what has happened historically, whether there has been an increase in the pace of decarbonization or not, this graph shows that there is a long, long way to go, especially if we have very high GDP growth targets, and at the same time, we have to deal with growing population. And so this is reported for every country in the document. We are showing what has to be the expected GDP growth rate and the resulting population growth rate. And as a result, what will be the required carbon intensity reduction for the economy. But then this is where also the simulation of intervention options is required. This is where we need to see whether the intervention options that have been mentioned and discussed in the NDC are in fact adequate to reach these targets. Because we see cases in which GDP has to increase by 30, 40, 50, 60% in the next 10 years, while historically in the past 3 years, 4 years since 2015, it has only increased by 3 or 4%. And of course, if you think forward, then this is where the COVID discussion that Jeremy mentioned before plays a very important role, where we can see whether the reduction in economic growth that comes with the pandemic is used as an opportunity and sort of a free lunch in a way when it comes to emissions, but not when it comes to economy. But is it an opportunity that the reduction in economic growth, as we have seen historically for some countries, allows us to reduce the investment required to meet the targets that we have? Or is it the opposite going to be true or realized, that the push for economic growth will reduce the progress towards decarbonization, meaning that we have a much bigger economic growth that is more carbon intensive, and hence we will need even more money than expected in 2015, than estimated today, to then reach the same targets we have for 2030, and even more so the decarbonization targets that the EU and other countries are starting to design for 2050. So this is an overview of the main results. And as you can see, in the presentation today, we have more food for thoughts, really. In the report, you find more targeted analysis. But I hope that this is an initial overview that is useful to you to understand the type of insights that come out of this study. And I pass on the word again to Jeremy for some additional remarks.
Thank you, Andrea. That was a fascinating overview of some of the data insights emerging from the model. One piece I wanted to add, I apologize that I did not repost the link. I will in a few minutes when I stop sharing my screen. I didn't want to leave screen mode to do that. But also related to the report that just came out last month, another element included in the country profiles that relates to Andrea's comment about Indonesia are some market and policy insights for each country from the past decade. And in those, our intention was to highlight some of the issues, be it politics or otherwise, that may have influenced the ambition, the rate of improvement, or some of the other factors that Andrea highlighted. So definitely take a look at those country profiles for more insight. Before we get to the Q&A section, and please now is the time to share any questions you may have in the chat box or start raising your hand. I wanted to wrap up with applications of this work to broaden and answer questions or challenges that our partners or clients in the future may have. So 3 quick examples here that I wanted to elaborate on. One has to do with geographic expansion of the model. We have covered 11 countries and have some in-depth data and tracking for those 11 countries. But obviously, ideally, we would like to expand the coverage to different countries, also to different groupings of countries. For example, we only have a few EU countries at the moment that are covered. It would be wonderful to look at all of the EU countries so that, again, we could start to disaggregate and isolate individual country dynamics from the whole. Secondly, customization, and this link is in the chat box so that you can learn more about customization. But what model customization is about is it's taking a look at assumptions, policies, and targets that are part of the model currently, and allowing our partners and clients to change those variables and to run different simulations. So on the assumption side, as Andrea mentioned, we have different forward-looking assumptions around GDP, energy prices, population growth. But what if we change them? What type of outcomes would be different? So that's an example of how the model is quite nimble and versatile in being able to be customized for different types of questions. The same would be true related to policies and targets. So what if renewable energy targets were dramatically increased in a given market? How would that have an impact on the model outputs? What about investment and things like renewable energy? Or what if energy intensity changes dramatically? So those are all variables that are listed on the website that we encourage you to take a look at if you have an interest in possibly partnering to take this work further. Lastly, and this goes back to another point Andrea was making, we often, a lot of the, I'd say, macro high level reporting around the energy transition and energy markets globally tend to look, as they should, from a very macro 35,000 feet view. And what we believe this analysis and modeling can provide is a more detailed, localized view at the national dynamics that may be of interest to stakeholders in the energy sector as they try to understand the climate transition in different national markets and how that will impact their business models. So we're ready now to transition to the Q&A section. For the moment, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can return to the Q&A box where I will in a second post the link again to the report. Some questions came in before that I'd like to address. One of them, I think, speaks well to the customization point. And then the second one I will direct to Andrea around renewable energy. The first question had to do, again, with COVID-linked stimulus. And the question was about how can any new policies or government spending linked to the COVID-19 pandemic be incorporated into the model? And this is a great question that's very timely as well. And that is very directly answered, I think, by the customization piece that I already described. So the beauty of the model is its versatility and the fact that if governments, and I hope we see more of this as the year progresses, are directing significant public spending towards renewable energy or efficiency or other factors that will influence the trajectory of their emissions, we're able to rapidly incorporate them into the model for the 11 countries where we have tracking at the moment. And then we can go from there in terms of seeing in real time what types of outcomes would result. So that's an excellent question, and I think one that is more and more important as we are seeing such large amounts of government spending, stimulus spending going on right now globally. The second question, which I will pass to Andrea, was how do the rapidly falling costs of different types of renewable energy, how does that impact in the past and the future generally the outputs from the modeling that you've created?
Thank you, Jeremy. Also, thank you for participants for sharing these questions. They're very, very interesting. I'll start actually by providing some thoughts on the first one, and then I'll switch to the second one. On COVID, what I think is interesting is that the model that we have developed, and those from the same methodology. We use system dynamics as the underlying methodology. Work with what is called a closed loop type of system or representation of reality. Meaning that we have the possibility to estimating GDP in the model and not use it as an external input in most cases. So that any spending, even beyond what is the energy sector policy that we're implementing or that we are considering. So any spending that could be on health, could be on road infrastructure, let's say on infrastructure in general, would be introduced into the model to update the forecast for GDP and then show what is the resulting energy consumption and the amount of emissions that are generated. So that if we start looking at a green recovery, in addition to these investments to allow the economy to start again and to grow according to country expectations and goals, then if we add a renewable energy and energy efficiency, we can show the synergies. We can show how by introducing these interventions, we reduce the energy cost, for instance, or the energy bill for the country, for businesses, which pushes productivity higher or higher when compared to a conventional investment that would not target these type of interventions. What we then can add also that we have done in several cases is to add the cost of health and how emissions and their pollutants affect labor productivity. A better labor productivity increases economic activity. And so it drives higher government revenues, giving more potential for investments in the economy to introduce renewable energy and energy efficiency. But at the same time, it drives consumption higher. So again, with a closed loop type of model, we can represent both synergies and trade-offs that happen through GDP and the increase of GDP or the decline of GDP, as we have seen in some of the cases earlier. So we take that systemic approach in a way that provides a bit of an advantage in having a more realistic and consistent policy analysis. On the cost of renewable energy, that is an interesting topic because I see in the past few years, expectations for the reduction of the cost has slowed down investments. Meaning that if there is an expectation that the cost will decline, we first start with the options that are cheap. And then once these other renewable energy options become more economically viable, we start investing in these areas. On the other hand, there are others that have invested extensively for two reasons. One, take China, for instance, because developing infrastructure and production capacity is an economic development policy, as simple as that. Whether then the production is used domestically or for exports, it generates jobs in the manufacturing process. And so it is a policy that is considered, nevertheless, from any emerging technology. On the other hand, there are other countries that have invested mostly because of the synergies, again, the externalities that are avoided when investing in renewables, meaning that if we invest in renewables, even if on a levelized cost of electricity generation, they may be a bit higher than other options. If we start factoring in the social cost of carbon, the cost to health directly, the potential employment creation and income creation, renewables have been much better than many of the other technologies that are competing for power generation for quite a few years. And so with the reduction of the cost, we can see now more investments, we can see more capacity being installed for the same investment, and so more benefits per dollar. So a higher amount of societal benefits per dollar invested. So we will see the energy bill declining even more, which will bring more potential for avoided costs, savings, extra investments. But at the same time, as I said before, these extra investments have to go back into renewable energy and energy efficiency because it pays off, rather than going into carbon intensive interventions. So again, we see the positive outcomes, but we also see the potential side effects, the rebound effect, to be taken care of. To make things more complicated now, as you can imagine, we also have the low price of oil and petroleum products, which sort of rebalance the system. But that could potentially go away as the economy starts growing again worldwide, with oil prices and fossil fuel prices possibly increasing, while at the same time we see a continuous reduction in the cost of renewables. So interesting dynamics, and when they all come together in a systemic view or in a systemic assessment, we can really appreciate not only the energy sector angle, but the macroeconomic and sustainable development angle that they allow us to analyze.
Great, thank you, Andrea. A few questions coming in over email, but before I get to those, I wanted to answer a question, really interesting question about biodiversity. The question was, what is the next stage on systems thinking around biodiversity? Could be interesting to chat through this. I will mostly pass to Andrea on that, but a few thoughts that I've had just from the information flow. I think awareness around many topics in green economy thinking is sometimes obscured by the complexity and how you can't see a lot of these things visibly. There's a lot of kind of abstract analysis and modeling and a lot of stuff that Andrea and I have been talking about today. I think with biodiversity, what we're starting to see is visible, clear linkages between the puncturing of biodiversity boundaries by human activity and economic development, and these very dramatic economic, environmental, and social outcomes, many of them negative. So I would just say that in terms of the future of systems thinking there, that there might be some breakthroughs in terms of just people's ability to grasp the linkages and the system's impact in ways that perhaps were not as explicit in the past. But I'd love to hear Andrea's thoughts as well.
Yes, thank you. From my side as well, this is a very good question. And there is a lot of discussion globally now on nature-based solutions, which is not necessarily connected only to biodiversity. It's connected to ecological integrity, ecosystems, broadly speaking, which provide ecosystem services, some of which are comparable to the built infrastructure that we create to obtain services. Could be buildings, could be power generation, roads, and so on and so forth. I'm adding now a link to the chat for everyone, 2 links on the Sustainable Asset Valuation Project that I've been working on with IISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which aims at quantifying the value of nature-based solutions and compare them with infrastructure, with conventional infrastructure projects. But I agree with the comment made and what Jeremy said, that we start seeing more and more often evidence, because we had notional knowledge of this, but now there is more and more evidence that investing in maintaining ecosystems, in maintaining habitat for biodiversity, pays off more than losing that series of ecosystem services and building something to replace it. So it's a lot more economical to maintain nature, to sustain its quality, its condition, and then use its ecosystem services for the long term. Now, on the methodologies, there is, again, ongoing work from the UN Statistics Division on the system of environmental and economic accounts and the experimental accounts that aim at creating a solid database, method and data to improve models and analysis to carry out this type of assessment. So there is a lot going on under the surface. The bits and pieces are becoming more accessible now, but there is an important mass of work that will become available within the next months and years.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Some other questions coming in. One that's what's interesting on the political dimension. The question had to do with how can we have any hope about progress or accelerating ambition in many of the countries in your study when the leaders of some of those countries are climate denialists themselves? That's a very direct and real question. And I think that it dovetails for me to the biodiversity discussion, because when we saw the direct impacts of COVID-19 on the economy and on employment, that is really, I think, waking people up to how directly linked a lot of these phenomenon are. Therefore, perhaps, and I'm being optimistic here, there's the same type of pattern that could evolve with climate, where you will have more direct evidence, more direct impacts in terms of economic loss on the populations that are most affected by it, which then will invalidate or really directly challenge climate denialism as a platform for leaders, not to mention the economic trends where the viability of some traditional fossil fuels is becoming almost obsolete in some markets. And so those factors together, I think, can combine to hopefully make progress. One other piece that I will add, and we published a survey earlier this year related to perceptions of progress in the 2020s and how practitioners in this space viewed the main levers of accelerating progress in the 2020s. And one of the main findings or answers from our survey sample on that, besides a real interest in market forces and markets being more configured to account for climate risk, had to do with grassroots organizing. And we saw just yesterday in the United States evidence of how powerful grassroots organizing was to block some of the pipelines proposed that were quite controversial in this country. And actually many of the proponents of those pipelines directly credited or bemoaned the power of grassroots movements. That's what was responsible primarily for them being delayed. So that's two areas where I think that the political dynamics may change in the coming years. Andrea, I don't know if you have any thought on that question.
Yes, no, I agree with you, Jeremy. Ultimately, if people determine the direction that should be taken. And if I look at the data, I'm not going to share good news here, I'm afraid. If we see the performance of governments up to now, I'll just pick a few examples. Like we said, Brazil had a 4% reduction of emissions with a close to 4% increase of GDP in the last couple of years. Up to 2030, emissions should decline by 12%, but GDP is expected to increase by 40%. Now, this is not a government that is particularly climate friendly at the moment. Let's take the US. Emissions were flat in the past few years. GDP grew by 7%. Expectations for the future, the goal for emission reduction is 24% from now up to 2030. GDP should increase by just about the same amount, 23.74%. That is the expectation in the next 10 years. Now, this shows how challenging this is for two governments where there isn't a particularly climate-friendly administration. Let's pick some others. If you look at Canada, Canada managed to have flat emissions like the US, but economic growth around 10%, a little bit more than the US. But the emission reduction is 27% expected, 28, close to 28%, again, very close to what we see for the US. But the expected GDP growth rate, or GDP overall up to 2030, is 63%. So twice as much the average growth that we could expect year on year for the US. So here we see that the government is more climate friendly, but past performance about the same as the one of the US. And then future effort a lot higher because there has been a higher ambition in the NDCs. If we pick other cases, China, 4.8% increase in emissions with 20% increase of GDP in the last few years. Emissions until 2030 should increase only by 2.4% with the GDP growing by 110%. So overall, we can continue the list and review all the countries. Indonesia is another one, India is another one. But all of them, there is a massive, massive need for an increase in action to meet the ambition. And I don't see any differentiation here on the type of government and the type of support they provide at the moment or have in the last few years for low carbon development. Now, this is where we have a lot of the work that other organizations are doing. Take WRI with the New Climate Economy Project in bringing more awareness and information at country level, also with models and tools, system dynamics models, for instance, where they can show the co-benefits that are in fact fully embedded in macroeconomic planning of achieving a low carbon development. And so we have cases for Brazil, for Ethiopia, for Colombia, for China. There are many, many countries where this is happening. But there are some organizations that set up the work plan just to do that, and others that may work on energy or land use or transport or buildings and try to make a quick connection to the macroeconomic performance or the macroeconomic discussion. I think based on what we have seen here, that the NC type of work, the WRI type of work is right there at the crux of the problem. We need to tackle these head on. It has to be a systemic approach being used regardless of political priorities. Anytime we have an increase in GDP, at the moment, we create more challenges for emission reduction, regardless of the government we have. More action is needed. And this is where we go back to the opportunity with COVID, massive public investment. It's the one opportunity to get it right. If we don't get it right now for low carbon development, then we're kind of stuck for the long term, given the long lifetime of any investment we make now in infrastructure or fixed capital.
Right. Yeah, no, it's very interesting. We're heading towards the conclusion of the webinar. There's one more question that came in online. Just a reminder to participants, if you have a question, type it in now or raise your hand so that we can get to it. The question that came in had to do with the social dimension of all of this discussion and the vibrancy around inequality right now that's being talked about in different countries and societies. And the specific question was, how does your work in modeling account for the social dimension of climate change and the climate transition? And that's an excellent question. And I would say the focus right now on the social dimension in many countries and discourses is all the more reinforcement for systems thinking and how we have to really start to not just look in isolation at specific factors related to emissions or economic variables, but to look at the entire system of how it impacts social factors as well. And that's an area that Andrea mentioned earlier. One example from the model, and you'll see this more, I would say, in the first report from 2015 than in the report from 2020, where we explain in quite a bit of detail, not just projections related to the economy, but also employment, and looking at different types of employment outcomes in renewable energy sectors as jobs may transition from some traditional energy sectors to renewable energy sectors that have different labor intensity, different types of pay structures. And so that is one example I can give of how the model as it's currently configured accounts for the social dimension. Andrea, I don't know if you have anything to add on that topic.
Yes, so I agree with what you said. The model at the moment captures employment creation from the implementation of investments that are policy related or policy driven or simply driven by demand, GDP, population, and so on. The one aspect we are not capturing at the moment with what is in the study is the potential social impact of policies, meaning that depending on how a policy or the provisions described in the policy are set up, we will see different impacts on society, different distributional impacts. Take the example of subsidy removal. So this is something that we haven't done yet. We haven't looked at the specific impact of policies. We have started from the INDC, from the NDCs, and looked at what happens if the target is reached. What happens if it is reached with the actions that are being envisaged? But there is a whole different field of analysis where policy can be assessed for the social outcomes it can have. Examples are the Global Subsidy Initiative of IST that focuses extensively on that aspect, but also the work again of the New Climate Economy Project and see on the impacts of different types of population, groups of population, urban versus rural, for instance, as opposed to different types of jobs that are created in the economy for different sectors, as opposed to income classes. So there are many different ways to do that, but we touch upon this on a very qualitative level, high level for now. We focus on the what if, what is going to happen if that target is reached, regardless of the type of policy implemented.
Thank you, Andrea. I see one hand from Fred Stotz. Just one moment, and I can unmute you.
Hi, Fred Stoss. I'm a science librarian at the State University of New York, University at Buffalo, and have been involved with climate change issues for about 35 years or more. What can we librarians do, especially those of us that are working in science arenas, do to get more people to involve us in the decision-making processes and helping with our own expertise and access to information, resources, data, and especially with considering that we probably operate one of the most trusted and largest information infrastructures worldwide. Both the International Federation of Library Associations and other library associations have policy statements on related to climate change. I actually wrote the one for the American Library Association and would love to see us getting more involved. But it's a big difference between me trying to volunteer or others trying to volunteer as opposed to being asked if we could contribute. So if there's any comments, I'd just like to hear what they might be, and thank you.
Thank you, Fred. That's an excellent question. One that I've thought a little bit about, actually, more in the pandemic era, if you will, of 2020, because many people don't appreciate how digitized and networked libraries have become in the past decade. And I think a lot of people still have this idea that libraries are operating in sort of an older school model in terms of hardcover books, et cetera. So I guess my point or answer to your question would just be greater networked collaboration in terms of bringing in these topics, however you do it in the context of a library and the communities you served, making that connection explicit, reaching out to different NGOs. You know, Andrea mentioned a few with the World Resources Institute, et cetera, that have developed initiatives like ours in this regard, so that we can have webinars, we can have exchange, so that the linkage between practitioners and academia can be solidified and built upon. I'll just say one last thing on that, which is that when I go through inquiries on a weekly basis related to this work or the Global Green Economy Index or other efforts, 80% of the inquiries come from students globally, comes from PhD students, master's students, even younger than that increasingly. So you're right to also to point out how, you know, this is the future of this movement and of this work. And so let's do what we can to really solidify those connections. Andrea, anything you'd like to add there?
Yes, just briefly. I mean, my experience is that depth of knowledge, unfortunately, doesn't help all that much. And I'm sort of smiling, but I say it in a very sad way. What I think helps a lot, or that helped me in my work taking a systemic approach, is to try and speak the language of the audience that you want to inform. That is why in our 2015 study already, we talked about economic growth, we talked about employment creation, not only about emissions, not only about the consequences of emissions. So I think the core message for me is to try and shape your message according to what resonates well with the audience. And then in my personal work, I mean, what we're doing with Jeremy now is a bit of an exception, that we publish our own work because we think it's relevant and useful. But in most cases, we have access to decision makers at national level, be it a minister or technical staff in a ministry, or being congressional hearings in the US like I've done in the past, because of others. Because of organizations like the UN system, the UN Environment Program, the UN Development Program, because of the World Resources Institute, NNC, because of the Global Green Growth Institute, GGGI. So maybe one option is to get in touch with them, offering your services, offering your knowledge, because they know how to then communicate this type of information. They know how to integrate it into their work to have a more effective communication with the local stakeholders and impact in the end.
Very good points. An excellent point to conclude on, the importance of connections and networks. I want to
Jeremy,
thank
if I
everyone.
may add, if resilience can be viewed as an integral part of sustainability, which includes addressing our climate crisis, also, the COVID-19 is giving us a dress rehearsal for what we should be doing and can be doing internationally with regard to climate change. I know of one association, the American Meteorological Society. I've been a past chair of the Atmospheric Science Librarians International, which is an affiliate of AMS. And we actually share conference time with them at their annual meeting, which will be in New Orleans in January. We hope it's going to be a physical conference. But I've been trying to get my librarian colleagues to stop going to library meetings and talking about climate change, but going to climate change meetings by science societies and talking about what libraries can do. So we can flip it that way, but I would like to see the other side of the equation coming to us and saying, what can you do with your expertise and your outreach and networking capabilities to help us reach to the people. Here, I live in New York, and we have the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is more of an energy-related piece of legislation for looking for smart energy technologies. And we have the great potential for being the interface between small business concerns, for which public libraries serve as essentially the technical information centers. So
Yeah.
we've got a lot that we can be contributing.
No, that's great contribution, Fred. Thank you. And we'll definitely keep that in mind, all of us, as we move forward. Excellent. Well, thank you for everyone's attendance and contribution. Again, we've put the link again in the chat box for the most recent report, as well as emails to contact us. Looking forward for sure to continuing the exchange. And also we will be updating all of you in the coming months as we continue this work and continue to report as we all move towards the COP26 next year in Glasgow. Thank you again. Thank you, Andrea, so much. And a good day and evening to everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, Jeremy. Bye, everyone.